Welcome back to the Luke's Properties YouTube channel. If you haven't already, then please subscribe, as it does help the channel grow. If you're listening to the podcast on Apple Music or on Spotify, then welcome too. In this episode, we're going to discuss rent to rent. We're going to talk about the pros and the cons to try and give you a more well-rounded perspective of this strategy. So let's get into it. So first, let's talk about some of the pros of rent to rent. Now, in terms of building your own rent to rent business and you being the operator, the first pro would be that you don't need to have a mortgage to get started. You don't need a mortgage because you're not buying the property. You're controlling the property by renting it over a fixed term. To qualify for a mortgage, you have to have a good income, you have to have good credit. With rent to rent, you don't necessarily need either of these. Second point, you don't need to have a deposit with rent to rent. So in terms of buying a property, you'd need to get a mortgage, but you'd also need to put down 25%, which can take quite a lot of upfront capital. Whereas with rent to rent, all you need is 1 to 2 months rent and maybe some money for furnishings. Another point to consider is when you buy property, you need to pay stamp duty. Now in my area, in Wales, this can be 4%. In England, it's 3%. But if you think about a £100,000 property, paying 4%, it's an extra £4,000, it's another cost. Whereas with rent to rent, you don't have to pay stamp duty. So basically, you need a lot less money to get started in rent to rent than you would do with buy to let. Now let's talk about some of the pros of rent to rent for a landlord. Now typically, with HMO properties or even single lets sometimes, when landlords manage them themselves or when they give them to estate agents to manage, there can often be void periods in between tenancies. Typically in HMOs, tenants stay for an average of 6 months, sometimes longer, but on average it's normally around 6 months. In between those tenancies, there's a void period, which means the property is empty, but the mortgage doesn't stop. So the bills still remain the same, the landlord still has that cost, but they haven't got any tenants to pay the cost for them, so it comes out of their own pocket. With rent to rent, the rent to rent operator offers a guaranteed rent so that the landlord doesn't have to worry about void periods. They're going to get the same amount every single month for a fixed period of time, normally 3 to 5 years. Another pro of rent to rent for the landlords is maintenance. Now typically most rent to rent companies will handle minor maintenance around the building. So to summarise the pros of rent to rent for a landlord, the landlord gets to hand their keys over to someone trustworthy and they get to benefit from a long-term fixed passive income. Now let's talk about some of the cons of rent to rent, because there are some, and I think it's good to give you guys a well-rounded perspective. So the first con is that you don't get to benefit from any capital appreciation. So when you buy a property, typically over time they go up in value and you get to benefit from that increase in value. Whereas with rent to rent, you don't get to benefit from that increase in capital appreciation because you don't own the asset, you're simply controlling it. So if you had a 5-year rent to rent deal on a property, you may make some really good cash flow over that 5-year period, probably more than some buy to let landlords. But the drawback is the landlord has actually benefited from the property going up in value and you haven't. Another con of rent to rent is that you are now exposed to all of the elements of being a landlord. So you may not own the property, but you are controlling the property. And part of your service as a rent to rent company is that you're going to pay all of the bills, you're going to guarantee no voids, and you're going to pay even if there are void periods. You're going to organise for minor maintenance around the property to be done. In summary guys, rent to rent is a fantastic way to get started in property with minimal funds. Anyone can do this. You don't need to be a genius. You need to be disciplined, trustworthy and organised and willing to put the work in. Once you get to 4 or 5 of these properties, you're going to be making enough money to start employing people. And this will allow you to focus on what's important, which is growing the business. I hope you found this video useful, or if you're listening on the podcast, then I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you are watching on YouTube, please remember to subscribe, as it does help the channel grow. And as always, I'll see you on the next one.